Okay. All right. Ready? Welcome. Welcome to Perkins, and I'm so excited that all of you are here, and I'm excited about the afternoon. My name is Dave Power. I am the new CEO of Perkins. I've been here a couple of months in this role, but I've been involved with Perkins for over 27 years because I'm the father of a disabled son who's 27, who was a student here at Perkins, graduated 5 years ago, and so very familiar with all of what goes on here at Perkins. For more than 185 years, Perkins has championed the rights of the disabled with a focus on blind, deafblind, and multi-handicapped. And here in historic Dwight Hall, where we're standing today, this has been a venue for many prior forums for Massachusetts political leaders at the national, state, and local level. So there's a lot of psychic energy in here for the kind of forum and debate we're about to have. We're proud to host this gubernatorial candidate forum in partnership with leading disability organizations from across the Commonwealth. And I just want to read out the names of these organizations who've been working with us on this important event today. Bay State Council of the Blind, Arlington Commission on Disability, Somerville Commission for Persons with Disabilities, the Watertown Commission on Disability, the ARC of Massachusetts, Easter Seals Disability Services, and Boston Center for Independent Living. And so I'd now like to ask our co-sponsor, John Winsky of the Disability Policy Consortium, to also help me welcome you. John?
Thank you. First of all, thank you to David Power and everyone at Perkins. They have been fantastic at helping us get the word out. We're so excited that you all are here today. We are 6 months away from the final election and 3 months away from the primaries. For the first time in 8 years, Deval Patrick's name will not be on the ballot. Our future literally hangs in the balance. Justin Dart once said, "Get involved in politics as if your life depended on it," because it does. Today, there are probably 100 of you here, hopefully even more as the day goes on. The 7 candidates that remain are all coming here today. That says so much about the power of our community and the role we are playing in society. We're 15 years post-Olmsted, we're 24 years post-ADA. There is so much work that remains to be done. Today, savoring the victories that we have, listen closely, and think about who you want to guide us into the future as our leader of the Commonwealth. I'll now turn it back to Dave Power, who will introduce our host today, moderator today. And lastly, I want to give a quick thanks to Bill Allen, who I don't know anyone else who could have pulled off getting all 7 candidates here. But again, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, John. This event is being streamed live and will be accessible on YouTube. And for access to that YouTube channel, just go to perkins.org and you'll find access to it right on the front page. There will also be a live Twitter feed, and you can follow that Twitter feed with the hashtag DPCMAForum. DPCMAForum. Lastly, remember to vote and remember to have everybody you know vote. And so with that, I'd now like to turn the day over to our moderator, Gary Willis, well-known TV and radio journalist from the Boston area. Gary?
Thank you, Dave, and thank all of you for being here. I'd like to thank all of the candidates as well. Let me give you a brief idea of how the day is going to go. Each of the candidates will have an opportunity to come up to the podium individually. They'll have 10 minutes to speak to you, and then 10 minutes where they will take questions from you. Those questions, if you would like to ask, can be submitted on a 3x5 card. So if you have a question, make sure that you let somebody know that you would like to submit them. We will get the card to you. If you need assistance in writing out your question, that assistance will be provided. And then I will be presenting those questions to the candidates. If you have a question for a specific candidate, please make note of that. So with that, let's get underway. Our first candidate is Evan Falchuk, who is running on the United Independent Party. And Evan, we welcome you to today's forum.
Good afternoon. I'm Evan Falchuk. I'm 44. Grew up here in Massachusetts. I live not far from here in Newton with my wife, Felicia, and our 3 kids who are 14, 11, and 7. I've been a business person for the last 13 and a half years. I was the president of a healthcare business called Best Doctors, which is an employee benefit that helps people make sure they've got the right diagnosis when they're facing an illness. And during my time there, we grew that company from 9 employees to up over 600 employees. It was a remarkable experience because it's a company that had such a mission and a purpose to it. And I'm running for governor because I'm a voter who got tired of a 2-party establishment that I don't think takes people seriously or treats them seriously. As a voter, I want to see candidates who are willing to take on difficult challenges and have their nice platitudes about issues be matched by the money and financial resources needed to turn them into a reality. I want to see leaders who listen to people who are expert and understand issues. But instead, what we see are debates about left versus right and high taxes and low taxes and big government and small government. So I'm running, but I did it by founding the United Independent Party based on some very simple ideas: that everybody is equal, that everybody's civil rights must be protected, and that the government must spend our money wisely. It's a combination most people don't think the establishment represents anymore. It's the reason why a majority of voters in Massachusetts today aren't enrolled in either of the established parties. It's a big reason why only 27% of voters participated in the last statewide election. It's a big reason why 60% of the representatives in the House this year in Massachusetts are running unopposed, and about 50% in our state Senate are running unopposed. These are symptoms of serious problems with our democracy. And in this place, which is an experiment in self-government, we have an obligation as voters to do something about it. So let me tell you about a couple of issues that are exceedingly important in what my candidacy is about. And before I do it, I want to comment on something about the disability community and the people with disabilities in our state. I think that for far too long, in spite of the great advances that have happened since the ADA and Olmstead, that people with disabilities have been marginalized. They have been not treated as equal. They've been looked upon as other. You have. And that is not your fault. I'm not here to tell you things that you already know, but rather it is the responsibility for leaders and candidates and governors to go to communities that may not realize the way in which they see people with disabilities and confront them with the reality of how common disabilities are in our communities. And to let them see, if they can, if only for a moment, through the eyes of a person with a disability and how they experience the world around them. There's no way for a person without a disability to truly understand what it means, but they can catch a glimpse and they can understand and they can make policy in those ways. We face in Massachusetts a cost of living that is far, far too high, and it affects everybody, particularly those living in the middle or lower parts of our economic scale. It's driven by two major things: healthcare costs and housing costs. Our healthcare costs are so high because of the monopolistic consolidation of hospitals into these giant systems. Partners is the biggest one. And when they do this, they raise their prices. And what that means is that healthcare is more expensive and less accessible than it would be otherwise. It started under a Republican governor. Bill Weld, with his Secretary of HHS, Charlie Baker, decided to deregulate the hospital market, and that's when the consolidation started. It continues today because the Attorney General, Martha Coakley, approved and has filed the paperwork to allow for Partners to buy South Shore Hospital. It hurts consumers, it hurts businesses, it hurts people who want to have access to health care. And it belies the nice-sounding words we hear from candidates about how they want to make sure health care is affordable and accessible to everybody. Actions must match words. We also have a problem that we do not construct housing in Massachusetts in any really meaningful way, especially housing that is affordable to people. Not just affordable housing, but workforce housing. Housing in communities that are designed in ways that are smart, so it's easy to get around. It doesn't require extensive use of transportation to get to stores and amenities and schools. We can do all these things, but not without a new framework. So I want to finish with this point. I founded the United Independent Party to create a new framework for new people to get into our legislature, not just so that you could elect an independent governor, which would itself be a historic event in Massachusetts, but to say, when we look towards 2016, for all those races where we find legislators who are either running unopposed or not doing the people's business, that we will be able to place smart, independent candidates who believe in taking people seriously and treating them seriously, and become not some third party, but to do what is so needed in our politics, and that is to have a second party, the second largest party, to create true accountability in our government and to bring about smart, brave reform. So I'm Evan Falchuk. You may have seen I've had the great honor this week with myself and my running mate of earning a spot on the ballot in November, which is a great honor. I hope to have an excellent conversation with you about the important issues that we face, and I humbly ask for the opportunity to earn your vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. Evan, you had mentioned housing, and certainly affordable housing is one of the big issues in this state, but accessible housing for this particular community is extremely important. And we're wondering, if you were fortunate enough to take the office on Beacon Hill, what would your strategy, policy be towards encouraging and perhaps incentivizing the construction of more accessible housing?
So the first thing about this is that we're just not constructing enough housing of all kinds, And the major reason for this is that cities and towns believe it is not in their financial best interest to allow for lots of new housing to be constructed. So they zone in ways that makes it so you don't see a lot of new homes being built. Or if you do, they're very large McMansions. They're cutting down wooded areas and green spaces and putting them into these big subdivisions. Sprawl is a good word for it. Not the kind of multi-family housing that so many people say they want and we know that they need. Now, the state has known this for years. There's been a report that Governor Patrick has been supportive of that says we need 10,000 additional units of multifamily housing in Massachusetts every year in order to keep up with demand. But there is no statewide policy to make this into a reality. The way we will do this, we issued a plan, you can find it on my website, the Thriving Communities Action Plan, that lays out a really specific roadmap as to how. To make it really simple, it has to do with funding education and infrastructure properly. The state isn't doing it, so the towns worry about having kids in their communities. And when it comes to the accessibility of homes, we should be able to have tax incentives to make it possible for builders to find it to be in their best interest to make homes accessible so that they're available to the large numbers of people in our Commonwealth who need those kinds of homes. But it has to always be part of a larger strategy to make sure that we're building substantial amounts of new housing. The plans that we put forward in my campaign are very specific and very direct. And in that sense, I suppose, very different from what we tend to hear in our politics. And I think that's extremely important to make sure that people are clear on those issues as they discuss them.
Certainly, smart housing, as you mentioned, being accessible to transportation. Accessibility to transportation is another issue that folks with disabilities struggle with, Evan, as you well know. What will you do as governor to ensure that policies are created, that laws are enforced, which will allow for public transportation to be accessible to disabled persons, but also to increase the availability of services like the ride, perhaps increase the hours that those services are available and the geographic areas that they are available?
It's extremely important to do these things because, once again, we have to recognize, and I don't think state policy truly does, the core individuality and personhood of every single person in our Commonwealth. So if we're going to say we've got public transportation that's open to everybody, then it better be open to everybody. And to the extent it's not, then we have a responsibility as a state to fix it. Now, the things that need to be done, there have been commissions looking at the accessibility of public transportation, have been reasonably well documented. There's always more work that can be done, no question about it. But the money's not there. And I see how the state spends its money. And I say, if legislators are saying that there isn't enough money available to make sure that every person in this Commonwealth is able to live a free and independent life, no matter what disability they may have, then they're not doing their job. They're just not doing their job. And I don't know how to put it more plainly than that. So there has to be money available for this. There has to be money available. I was just talking to my friend Kathy when we started, and she was talking about where she lives, that the sidewalk isn't accessible in front of her home. That's not even able to get to where the public transportation is. So when we don't think in these comprehensive terms and are always looking for the Band-Aid solution that will keep people that are advocating for issues quiet, it's not good enough. And we need leaders who are willing to engage with advocates in ways that allow for us to think in very bold ways about what we can do for the future, and to lay down a marker that says if everybody's equal and everybody has the same rights, that we have a responsibility to live up to it in the way that we spend our money.
Thank you, Evan. This is not a question from your friend Kathy. It's from Liam, but it's a similar issue. And Liam wants to know, how will you budget for audible signals on our sidewalks, especially big multi-intersection areas? You mentioned that you think the money is not being spent wisely. So do you think the money is there to allow for these adaptations?
Yes, the money is there. Look, if only, let's say, 3% of the state's spending was unnecessary, that's $1 billion a year. That's a substantial amount of money that could go to things like this, or could go to other services for funding education, for funding healthcare, for funding seniors programs, veterans programs. That's a lot. But also take a look at the other side of the ledger, because as a state, we give out giant tax breaks to big companies all the time. Intel is one of the more well-known ones. They got a $300 million tax break from the Commonwealth to keep a factory open that they ended up closing anyway. $300 million. So we've got an issue of priorities, because I know, for example, when you look at the Chapter 257 funding for social services workers, that is appallingly underfunded anyway. But let me make it a little bit worse. The law says they're supposed to be funding it properly, and the number of dollars available to do this is not some enormous thing where, oh my God, we got to raise taxes on everybody to do it. I don't understand how people can take the oath of office and then run a government that doesn't follow the law. It doesn't make sense to me. So when I say that I'm running to challenge the establishment, I mean it. We have to be able to call these things what they are. We have an obligation to pay for the government we say we want. We have an obligation to make sure that when our government makes commitments, it lives up to them. You think about these crossing signals. You know, the cities and towns are the ones that pay for that. The cities and towns will tell you they barely have the money to pay to make sure that their potholes are filled. So of course we should be having these audible signals. But that means that the state needs to do its part to make sure that cities and towns have the resources they need to make sure that their residents are living in safe, secure, vibrant, thriving communities in which everybody feels welcome.
Thank you, Evan. Evan, this question comes from Jim Cawley, and Jim works for an agency called Work Incorporated. And he notes that there is about a 70% unemployment rate with folks with disabilities. In March, the Obama administration issued an executive order to strengthen requirements established in Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act that would require federal contractors and subcontractors to set a hiring goal of having 7% of their workforces be people with disabilities. Would you, as governor, mirror this policy with state contracts in an effort to get employment for this underserved population?
Yeah, and I had a chance to talk to Jim briefly before we started, and it's a good idea to do that, even though I know as a business person there are many businesses that say we don't like the idea of things like set-asides. Although I'll tell you, I had a chance, last year actually, there was a great conference that was held by ADDP out at Bentley College, and it was talking, I went to the particular sessions that were about engaging employers and realizing the resource that's there of people with intellectual developmental disabilities that can work. And they had employer after employer that were telling these great stories of people that they had no idea that could be such great workers in various jobs and had never had access to them. So programs like what Jim works on and the other ones that I've seen open up whole new avenues for people to have opportunity, again, to live independently, to live fulfilled, meaningful lives, and, oh, by the way, to make some money and maybe pay some taxes. But those things are secondary. Those things are secondary. So once again, when we think about what it means to have leadership on a statewide level, you have to be thinking about, and I do this all the time, the process of electing a governor like a job interview. And listen to the person that you're talking to and see, is it in their heart when they talk about these things? Do they mean it? Or is it something they're saying because they know it will be what you like to hear? Now, I believe in these things. I think a 70% unemployment rate in a population where there are people that not only can work, but want to, and would find great meaning and purpose in that is such a lost opportunity. Such a lost opportunity. And we can do so much better with some smart and brave leadership.
And I think we have time for one last question, Evan, and it is, what does Community First mean, and where will it be in your budget priorities?
Well, I mean, it should already be funded. It should already be funded. We're talking about, $26 million in funding over 4 years, about half of which is going to be paid for by the federal government. How our state government cannot find that kind of money, I know it's real money, but they're spending $9 million to renovate the governor's office. So you'd think they could help people with disabilities transition into community settings and closed sheltered workplaces. Oh, it's also the law, again. So what's wrong with our government? What's wrong with our politics? What's wrong with our economy? Has everything to do with the way in which we're tied into the idea that this two-party establishment that is doing all the things that we're talking about, or more to the point, not doing the things that we're talking about. And so what I ask you to do and to consider when you visit the Falchuk2014.org website or go on our Facebook page or the United Independent Party Facebook page is to think, what is possible if we can create a new framework to bring new, smart people into our politics? And what it will be like when our legislature has lots of smart, independent candidates who believe that everyone is equal, who want to live by the words that everybody's civil rights must be protected, and who see their job as making sure that our government spends our money wisely.
Thank you very much, Evan. We
Thank you
appreciate
very
your
much.
time.
Thank you.
So we have about 5 minutes between presentations. I want to encourage you to submit questions if you have them. I'd also like to let you know that the Perkins store is open. If you desire a water or a soda, and you have an opportunity to meet some of the Perkins students who are working there as well. As we mentioned, this is being live streamed, So if you have friends across the globe, feel free to walk up here in front of the cameras and wave to them. And, then email them and make sure that, or actually alert them first that you're going to do that. So they'll have a chance to see you. So we'll have a couple of minutes before we, just a minute or two before we call up our next candidate. And we are now ready to... I should know better. I should know better. I apologize. I would now like to welcome our next gubernatorial candidate to the podium, and that would be Don Berwick, and Don is a Democratic candidate, and he's from Newton as well. Don, welcome.
Thanks so much. Thank you all. Thanks, Gary and Dave. And before I start, I not only want to thank Perkins, but also issue a congratulatory word to Steve Rothstein, who recently ended his leadership here. Thank him for his extraordinary service to the disability community. I say a few words about myself. I'm Don Berwick. I'm a pediatrician by training. I practiced for about 20 years at the old Harvard Community Health Plan. Many of my patients were children who had disabilities or were under other forms of stress. I also, at that point, began a nonprofit organization called IHI, the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, that works all over the world to make health and healthcare better for all communities, including people with disabilities. IHI is now 25 years old. It's global. It's $40 million a year, and I was the CEO, the founding CEO of that. Then President Obama asked me to come to Washington to run Medicare and Medicaid, which I accepted. The Republicans had other ideas. I was blocked by the Senate. They did not confirm me, but the president put me there anyway as a recess appointee, and so for 17 months, I was the administrator of Medicare and Medicaid and the Children's Health Insurance Program. As you know, that agency has the largest budget in federal government, $820 billion, 5,500 employees, and it's the lead agency for healthcare reform, including many of the reforms we're here to talk about today. I'd like to tell you a little story about my tenure there. I'd arrived in Washington in mid-July, and about a week or two after I arrived, I was visited by the security forces in the building, the Hubert Humphrey building. They were there to get me briefed on a security threat. The security threat was that ADAPT was coming. ADAPT is, as I hope you know, an amazing advocacy organization for people with very severe disabilities, and they are understandably vocal. In previous visits, they had handcuffed themselves to the gate in front of the building, for example, to make a point about policy issues that they cared about. I said, well, they're people that I'm supposed to help. Medicare and Medicaid exists for these people, so I'm happy to meet with them. And I was allowed to do so. I was called into the room where they had assembled with armed guards in the corridor, I must tell you. And I walked into a room that sort of changed my life. Sitting around the table were 25 or 30 people, the board and leadership of ADAPT, in wheelchairs and various forms of assistive equipment, many of them quite severely disabled, and evidently so. But there began a conversation that changed my whole attitude toward leadership at Medicare and Medicaid. They were, perhaps in my entire tenure there, the most articulate, caring, deep, and insistent people I got to speak with about what I regard as a basic issue of human rights. Disability rights are civil rights. I already knew a lot about disability from my work as a clinician and my leadership of improvement work, but I learned even more from them. There came a moment in my first meeting with ADAPT, although I met with them every time they were in Washington, and then I went out to Denver to visit their headquarters. I asked them at one point, as they were describing to me the experience in that case of being institutionalized, being in a nursing home or a rehabilitation facility for a long, long time. They described abuse and neglect and the loss of autonomy, loss of dignity, that many of them, in fact, personally had suffered. And it led me to ask them at one point, you know, when you come right down to it, if we really invested in the kind of independence that you so movingly represent, how many people would be in institutions? And they said 0. Now, that speaks to me. For my whole career, I believed that bold goals and vision informed by values are key to the beginning of the creation of the kind of communities we want. I know that the disability community can speak for itself. The phrase, "nothing about us without us," was central in the work of the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, but I also know that policy, state and federal policy, does a lot to determine whether people with disabilities will be able to live the kinds of lives they want to live. At Medicare and Medicaid, as administrator, I got to facilitate and in some cases begin, I think, some important steps, additional steps toward that kind of independence. It was during my tenure that we launched the community-based care transitions program that came under the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation under the Obamacare law. We worked hard on all sorts of transition opportunities for people from dependent settings to independent settings and building up resources at the community level that will allow people to live full and independent lives. In Medicaid, we got to issue waivers when I felt they were responsible, offering different forms of flexibility, new forms of flexibility to progressive states to offer community-based options and home and community-based care services. I was there when we were formulating the new program authorized under the Affordable Care Act to help dual eligibles who were getting a very raw deal in a fragmented payment system, which led eventually to the One Care program here in Massachusetts. I'm sure you may want to ask me questions about One Care, but at the core of the idea is to begin to unify payment structures and systems so we are not creating a fragmented, chaotic environment of support for people who need teamwork and cooperation as central to their ability to be as independent as they would like to be. I have based my campaign on basic values, principles that I think underlie building the future for our Commonwealth and our nation, principles that I think are very much at risk in the current political climate as people back down from moral commitments, commitments to social justice, to equality, to compassion as guiding forces in government. I believe this is very much at risk. When we pledge allegiance to the flag, we say liberty and justice for all, and all means all. So what does that mean for the disability community? Well, it means that you're sort of, in the disability community, I think a very important, iconic, I'll say a test case of our commitment to the right forms of human rights and justice. Everyone in our state should have the opportunity to live with pride and dignity to independence, and it is a function of government to make sure to the extent it possibly can that that is realized for this community and many others. It means full implementation of the Olmstead Act, which I fought for over and over again at CMS. It means joining in and setting the national standard in the Communities First initiative. It means embracing and expanding the Medicaid and Medicare waiver programs, especially including Money Follows the Person, which I spent a lot of time on and continued to work through my whole tenure on with ADAPT and other organizations and with my colleagues within government to foster independent living. But as you know as well as anyone, it's not just about health care. This means expanding and strengthening measures against bullying and abuse that occur for people who are independent in dependent situations. It means expanding housing and transportation, as you were asking Evan earlier about. It means focusing on work. My understanding is that over 60% of people with disabilities nationwide are not working. That number is much, much too high. We need to commit to job training at the state level to a truly successful model employee initiative and to ending or at least cracking down hard on sheltered workshop programs that take advantage of people with respect to both their safety and their income, their right to income. It means especially also reforming the safety net programs so that they're enforced, so that people with disabilities know they have enforcement behind them. And it means, in an exciting way, investing in assistive technologies to enhance inclusion and accessibility. When I decided to take the job at Medicare and Medicaid, one of the turning point moments for me was being in the hallway, the atrium of the Hubert Humphrey building, where my office would eventually be. And on the wall of the Hubert Humphrey building was chiseled a quotation from Senator Humphrey that's become a bit of rubric for my campaign. He said, and remember this was in the 1970s, "The moral test of government is how it treats people in the dawn of life, children, in the twilight of life, the aged, and in the shadows of life," he said, "the sick, the needy, and people with disabilities." This is a moral test. The topics you've pulled us together today to talk about, to me, are nothing less than an exploration of the moral center of our nation, much at risk today, and the moral center of our Commonwealth, which, in my opinion, ought to be a beacon on these issues for the nation as a whole. My name is Don Berwick, and I very much appreciate the chance to chat with you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Don. Don, this is a question from the audience. You are the only candidate supporting a single-payer system. How do long-term support services fit under the single-payer system?
Single-payer system, Medicare for all at the state level, is now possible, and I think our state should lead in that direction as it led in universal coverage in 2006. We can do it, and I'm the only candidate for governor fully embracing that as the plan for our next steps. Health care is 42% of our state budget, over $14 billion. We know that of that money, a substantial proportion, a quarter or a third, is pure waste. It helps no one at all. It's mistakes in care, complications that people get. It is failure to have proper competition for prices. It's some fraud. But it's also complexity that's embedded in the insurance system, probably to the tune of 10 to 15% of the total bill. We can stop that. If we have a single unified payment system in this Commonwealth, all of the money that supports healthcare coming into a single pool that's publicly accountable, transparent, responsive to a public with respect to their demands, and powerful with respect to standing up to some of the nonsense we're seeing in the pricing structures in healthcare, we will have a win for almost everybody. Imagine that we could get back 5% or 8% of the waste in the healthcare system that's focused just on paperwork, on things that drive patients and families and advocates and doctors and nurses crazy. That's $1 billion. That's $1.5 billion just in the state budget. And if we go to the private sector, it's a job creator. Because right now, the private sector burden of healthcare costs is keeping people from getting jobs, including people with disabilities. This returns resources to the private and public sector for other more productive uses. Now, you and I today have some very good ideas about where those resources could be used. If we could reform healthcare delivery the way it needs to be done and use the power of a single payer to do that, we have the resources then to implement Olmstead and to go farther with work training and vocational services and to make sure that assisted devices are available without compromise, to extend supports to patients with autism into their adult years. Think about the flexibility we have if we get rational about the way we use the healthcare dollar today. Single-payer healthcare, Medicare for all, is the single most powerful step I could think toward a system accountable, responsive, affordable, and standing up for patients and their rights, and that includes your rights.
Thank you, Don. You had mentioned what an eye-opening meeting you had in Washington, D.C., and the idea that perhaps nobody with disabilities should end up in any sort of institutionalized setting. Given that, how would you support independent living centers and programs?
In community-based independent living.
Community-based.
Well, luckily, with the Affordable Care Act, we now have statutory support for some important programs of transition and support in communities. That involves more than healthcare supports, by the way. It involves, of course, the housing supports we were talking about earlier, accessible transportation, but we have to think about it as an issue of community development. I want to harvest the resources from healthcare reform, and by the way, from a fairer tax code. we're going to have to do some investments to get human rights back on the screen where they need to be. And one of them has to do with having a tax code in the Commonwealth in which people at higher levels of income pay higher rates and people at lower levels of income pay lower rates. The disability community largely lives at very low levels of income. I do not want to burden that community further, but I'm happy to go to people who've earned their wealth honestly in this state to say, now you owe it back to the Commonwealth to give us a chance to create the support systems we need. The support systems we need are in the community. They have to do with the kinds of resources in vocational education, housing, transportation, and healthcare that lie at the community level. Given that goal, I think the possibilities for true independent living communities are nearly boundless, as ADAPT was trying to tell me, and I would strongly move in that direction, a very bold goal about decreasing dependence on institutions.
Thank you, Don. This question again from the audience. The federal government does not fund its share of IDEA education for people with disabilities. So how would you get Congress to move forward on their obligation with regard to IDEA education in Massachusetts?
Yeah, I'm tempted, having given my experience in Washington over 18 months, which I loved. It was a very important moment for me to be able to reach out to 100 million people in the dawn of life, the twilight of life, and the shadows of life to help them. But it led me to think that right now, we better not wait for Washington. This is a government in gridlock right now, people losing trust in the ability of government to solve large problems. And that's why I think Massachusetts at the state level needs really to provide the example, to be the beacon. And rather than plead helplessness about the federal government's willingness or unwillingness to support the kinds of innovations we're talking about and education, although we should fight like the dickens for that, and I would as governor, we need to take the ownership back here at the state level. We need to understand that we should be a state in which access to training, vocational opportunities, and by the way, thoroughly adequate, no, world-class elementary and secondary education is a promise we make to each citizen. And I think the legislature has got to step up and make that dream true here. Over time, the federal government will come to its senses, and when it does so, I'd like it to look at that state and say, hey, that is possible. Social justice, human rights, all the effective supports for a disability community really can be done. Look, they did it, now we'll have to do it as a nation.
I think we have time for one more question, Don. We've talked about some very broad concepts with regard to disabilities and disabled population. This one a little bit more specific. What is your intention regarding pushing accessible prescription labeling for blind and visually impaired, as well as the patient who is print reading challenged through the health insurance companies, including MassHealth?
It's not an issue I'm too familiar with. I've had a couple of patients for whom that was a problem, but I'd be happy to learn from this community about the kinds of regulatory or statutory changes you like to see. To me, this fits into the concept of social justice. Whenever there's a barrier between a person with a disability or a person with another challenge in their life, between them and full participation in the normal activities of living and effective communities, it is our job to stop it. So yes, absolutely, I'd be open to whatever you tell me is helpful for people to be able to understand the medications they're taking. I must say, if I can just take one more second, every time you ask me a question about independence and support, I do remember a kid that I took care of. He was probably from age 7 to 12 or 13. He became blind at age 8, he was just an amazing kid. We got to be, I think he liked me, I liked him, and he came in often to see me, and we often played games. And I remember losing to him over and over again I think it was checkers, even though he couldn't see. He then came back one day from his skiing vacation. Again, through the experience of people with disabilities, the sky's the limit. And I think we need to be a community that encourages people to just go fly as high and as far as they want. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. I think we're going to have a lot of thoughtful answers to your questions, so I encourage you to keep submitting them. We're going to have a short break in between the appearance of our next candidate. So again, remind you that the student store is open if you'd like to take advantage of that. I also would like to recognize a friend of Perkins and the disability community who is in the back of the room, Warren Tolman. Hello, Warren, how are you? Warren is a candidate for Attorney General, as many of you know. So if you have an opportunity to stop by, say hello, shake his hand, and then go home and tell your friends that you met Warren Tolman. All right? Thank you. We'll be back in just a few minutes. All right, here we go. Our next candidate is running as an independent, Jeff McCormick. And Jeff, you know the drill, 10 minutes, and then we're going to grill you for 10 minutes. So please, welcome to the podium.
First, I'd like to thank all of you for being here. I grew up in upstate New York, and I was very, very close to a friend of mine who went from a two-sport athlete to a quadriplegic after one very tragic accident. And at that point in my life, I started to realize how difficult it was to fight the good fight and come back. So I know the work so many of you in this room do. You should be really proud of your efforts, and I want everyone here to know that the American dream is here for everyone, and you are very much a part of it, and the goal is to create opportunity for everyone. Now, for those of you following the campaign, or my campaign in particular, you hear about Jeff for Jobs. For the last 27 years of my life, I've been working with very small companies to create jobs. Sometimes these companies, Constant Contact, we started with 2 people, 2 founders, and now employs over 1,200. And I just found out that one of them is from Perkins School. So I think that is just terrific. When I talk about creating opportunity and creating jobs, I mean for everyone. I think it is extremely important for us to work with everyone in society so that they can fulfill their potential. I am a huge believer in looking at people as whole people and trying to essentially surround people with whatever they need, again, so that they can achieve their potential. That is something I think government tends not to do. I think government tends to put Band-Aids on things and not, again, look at the whole person. I know there are a lot of examples of where the different verticals, if you will, of assistance do not talk to each other very well. That's a complaint I hear constantly, and not just in this arena. I hear it in all areas of healthcare. I hear it in education. So knitting the solutions together, again, is a really important part. And that's something that after 27 years of building businesses, that is something you are doing all the time. So that's a very, very important skill set, I think, that I bring to the table. I also want people to know that, I think that we need to tailor solutions to the particular needs of individuals. And I don't think we do that very well. I think we tend to have very, blanket solutions. I'm a huge fan of solutions being decided upon at as close to the individual level as possible. I think individuals do a better job of managing their lives than communities. Communities do a better job than towns. Towns do a better job than the state. And the state does a better job than the federal government. So as much as we can empower people that know the most, that are as close to the individual as possible, again, just as a guiding philosophy, I think that's where it tends to make solutions make the most sense. Because you hear so often of programs, again, that are very well intended that just miss the mark, or miss the mark with too many people, or don't give enough flexibility to the people who really know what is going on. And I know that this is fairly high-level philosophy, but I think it's a really important distinction in the way I look at the world, because that's how it has always worked in my life. We always say the devil's in the details, and it is in the details, and it is in the implementation. And when I visit places like Friendship Home in Norwell, and I see how they are looking at the entire solution, how they can help people to be as productive as they can in their lives, because we're all capable of contributing to society in different ways and different times in our life. Why I'm running for governor is I want to contribute to society now in helping millions of people. I've created thousands of jobs, and yeah, we've done well for a lot of people, but now it's time to take it to a different level. So that essentially is where I'm from. I'm here to learn. I love talking to people, hearing their questions and the insight that their questions offer, hearing their suggestions for solutions. I've done that throughout, again, my entire career. That's how you build great companies. That's how you solve problems. And believe me, there are a lot of problems that need to be solved. There's a lot of ways we can bring technology to bear to be much more efficient, to give people better outcomes, and to give people more opportunity. So with that said, I'd like to open it up to you to ask any question you'd like.
Sure. Thank you, Jeff. Well, you mentioned Jeff for Jobs. So let's start with an employment question. This one came, and the folks here have heard it before, from Jim Colley, who works for a human service agency called Work. And he mentioned that in March, the Obama administration issued an executive order to strengthen requirements established in Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act. And it would require federal contractors and subcontractors to set a hiring goal of having 7% of their workforces be people with disabilities. Would you, as governor, mirror this policy with state contracts in an effort to get employment for the disabled population?
You know, one thing I think we need to do is realize where the world is going. There are going to be so many job opportunities that are new opportunities, for instance, as the baby boomers retire en masse. And if you think about many jobs related to that, there are jobs that are going to require extraordinary patience and people that are very compassionate and people that are hardworking and people that are very reliable. And when you think of those traits, where can that come from? Again, that's just an area where we can develop specific training programs, I think, for a large number of people in the community. So the answer is, I do think that we ought to set goals like that. And I think the goals ought to be aggressive, because until you put it in people's mindset, they're not going to go there. It has to be top of mind. And the way you drive it is with ambitious goals like that.
Thank you. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about education, special education in particular, and the funding for special education. Specialized schools can provide very cost-effective education for students with complex disabilities, and providing an adequate funding stream would certainly relieve the burden on local school systems and offer the best opportunity for each student to be uniquely successful. There is also a program in Massachusetts, the circuit breaker funding, I believe, that is a reimbursement program where the state reimburses 75%, I believe, of the money that is spent on special education in the public schools. So I'm curious your position on specialized school and the state funding towards that, and also funding the circuit breaker law at the 75% that it was initially enacted.
Well, I'm certainly open-minded on this issue, but what I've heard throughout the state from a number of different organizations is it would be a lot better if the money followed the individual, and that we sought the absolute best program for an individual. A school like Perkins School, they would rather, if people can be in a mainstream situation, they would rather that individuals stayed in that situation. And I'm generally, again, a believer of that as well. But there are times, there's no question about it, that you want a more specialized, structured environment. No doubt about it. And again, that's why I feel that the closer we can get to the needs of the individual, what really works for her or for him, the better off we're going to be.
Certain members of the disability community are challenged more than others with regard to transportation issues. It can be a geographic issue. In most metropolitan areas, their options are better than they are in other areas of this state. As governor, what would you do to make sure that there is more accessibility in terms of transportation options for the disabled?
Well, beyond just transportation, just talk about accessibility. You know, the ADA was 20-some years ago. You know, I was in the early 90s. And I go places, even in Boston, where you think, yeah, it's a major metropolitan area. Boy, we've got to be pretty much up with, you know, compliance. We're not. We have, I hate to report, we have a long way to go. So everything we do from here going forward, again, that has to be very much top of mind, and encouraging people to, wherever possible, bend over backwards so that we're embracing, you know, the entire community. And it has to be part of the daily language. And that's where sometimes, you know, I think it's missing. Because, you know, unless it's front and center, people always, you know, they always have excuses. They always have other issues they take care of. One of the pieces of good news, though, is with the millennials, they're re-urbanizing. They're coming together, and with zoning changes and reform, as that continues to happen, that makes housing issues easier for everyone, by the way. That makes transportation issues easier for everyone. There will be more walkable cities, like you're seeing Boston get there, you know, in fits and spurts a little bit, but we're gonna start getting there more aggressively.
This question again from the audience, Jeff. You mentioned housing, and I think most of us believe it is a civil right to live in the most appropriate situation that you can, independently. What would you do to create more affordable, accessible, integrated housing in Massachusetts?
The problem with a lot of the housing in Massachusetts is just with some of the regulations that are in place, the only thing that can make sense, frankly, is just very expensive multi-unit housing. And there are ways of breaking that down. One thing we have to do, I think, throughout the entire Commonwealth is really support gateway communities. And that's something that I hear throughout, again, virtually all of those communities. A lot of that is about zoning reform. But within those regulations, just like you can blend, you know, other, you can have some subsidized rents. I mean, there's an awful lot of things you can do in developing that kind of housing. It is much more difficult, though, in a very expensive urban marketplace. It just is, just because of the sheer math of the way, you know, land costs work and development costs work, and given some of the bidding regulations on those contracts. There's no question about it. And you cannot repeal the law of supply and demand. That part of it's difficult. But there are ways you can extend transportation to areas that it is not so expensive, but you've got to do it in the right order. You have to execute it like a chess game.
We have all heard stories about the transportation infrastructure and all of those needs. With regard to the disability community, the infrastructure, the walking infrastructure is incredibly important, as you know. So what would you do to ensure that the compliance with the ADA, as far as sidewalk cuts, as with regard to accessible traffic signals, and also just repairs to cracks in the sidewalk and breaks in the sidewalk, which can create quite a big hazard for a lot of folks?
People need to remember that until you are in the shoes of someone who's disabled, it's very difficult to totally empathize, no matter how good-hearted you are. I think the skill you need more than anything else is listening. You need to listen to people, because people will point out right away where the infrastructure is just inadequate, and then you need to have a mechanism to act on it. And that's something, again, that I think government does not do well enough, is ask the questions and listen to people. This is not something that I think is going to come from, a couple hundred people in a legislature or a governor. The solutions are in this room. You have to let people know what they are. And if you just get the right ear, it will get done.
Again, from the audience, what does community first mean, and where will it be in regard to your budget priorities, Jeff?
Well, as far as what it means, again, you know, throughout all of my stumping and running around for the last year, I've been talking about the importance of communities, and I just mentioned in my opening remarks that to me, again, the solutions come from communities. There are schools that are looking at math scores and reading scores as much less important than a community score, because what children especially need, they need community, they need safety, and they need continuity. And if you think about it, you can get all that in a gang, but you can also get that from an amazing community like we have here at Perkins School. So the community first, if you get people in the right community and believing that they have potential, they have purpose, that they're driving forward to goals, you know, that keeps people on track to be really successful, productive members of society. And I honestly believe that. And where I came from, if I didn't have the kind of public school teachers I had, and I didn't have coaches who cared about me, I never would have been able to be standing in front of you today. I had to have that because we had no money, nothing. We didn't have resources in my family. So I feel very strongly and passionately about that statement. So build communities in any way, shape, or form, and they're going to look different. You know, there are communities that they're going to be more arts focused. There are communities that are going to be academic. There are going to be communities that are athletic focused. It doesn't matter, but you need an attachment to a community, and a positive one. So that's the general bias.
Thank you, Jeff. And I think we have time for one more question. This one comes from Juan Figueroa out in Holyoke, who submitted it via the web. If you become governor of Massachusetts, would you continue to pay disabled workers sub-minimum wages, or would you attempt to change any laws in the Commonwealth that allow certificates to employers so that they can continue to pay disabled workers sub-minimum wages?
I believe people ought to be compensated for what they're doing. And again, this area of elder care is going to be extremely important. I guarantee you that going forward. There's no question in my mind. So personally, I think that we ought to do everything we can so that people are compensated and well compensated for the work that they do. It doesn't make any sense to me why they wouldn't be. And I also think we need to change some of the regulations as to how much people who are disabled can save, because for, many of you may know, there's a certain point that you can actually start to lose some of your benefits, which again doesn't make sense to me, because isn't the goal that we should all have an opportunity to live the American dream? And you know, this is an intuitive comment, it's not a longitudinal study, but I would bet you with those kinds of individuals that have lived that life and have lived the American dream, they're going to put back into the system more than almost any other one of us.
Jeff, I appreciate your time. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. Again, we'll take a short break. One important announcement to make. I've been informed by the students at the store. Do they know that we're selling pizza for $2 a slice? So if you did not know that, consider yourself informed. The pizza is pretty good. Thank you. Thank you again for attending today's Gubernatorial Forum on Disabilities. And I'm so pleased to see that at least one person went and got pizza. So that makes me happy. I'd like to bring up our next candidate, and it is Mark Fisher. And Mark, you happen to be the first Republican of the day. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Gary, and thank you to the Disability Policy Consortium, and also to the Perkins School. We'll try this again. There you go. To lean in a little bit. Thank you, Gary, and thank you to the Disability Policy Consortium, and also to the Perkins School, and all the other co-sponsors who've made this event possible. It's my pleasure, it's my honor to be here today. In April of this year, April 7th actually, there was a legislative breakfast at the campus of Holy Cross in Worcester, and it dealt with disability issues. All the gubernatorial candidates were invited there, and I was the only one in attendance. All of the gubernatorial candidates are here today, so I thank them for following my lead and coming here. Now if they'll only follow my lead on all the other issues. I'm going to talk about just two things today, and then I'll open it up for your questions. The first thing I want to talk about today leads in with a story. About a dozen years ago, I applied for a job, and I was one of 3 finalists. I did not get the job. It was for the head of a company in Worcester, Massachusetts called Ultimate Mobility. Some of you may know of it. They assemble wheelchairs and scooters and mobility devices. Shortly after I was told that I didn't get the job, I received another phone call, and they asked me, "Are you still interested?" And I said yes, and of course I wondered why, what had happened. And they told me that the fellow that did get the job resigned after being there for 4 hours. He came in on his first day at 8 o'clock, and he handed in his letter of resignation at noontime. I wasn't daunted by that, though. I did take the job, and it's a good thing that I did. The company was on the verge of bankruptcy. And in working with the parent company, I helped to turn the business around. It survived, and it continues today, and it serves the disabled community in Worcester. The reason I bring up that story, I learned 2 big things about the disabled community in working for that job. The first one is this. Payments from the state are wholly or largely dependent on not only how the bills are given to the state, but when. Medical billing with coding and timings is extremely important. Some legitimate bills get denied and never get paid. That was the first thing I learned. The second thing I learned is that these mobility devices can leave the disabled community stranded, severely stranded, in the middle of the night, in the rain, in the elements. I'm sure you've all been witness to this or experienced it yourselves, that the batteries that power these devices fail, tires get flat, parts get broken, and you get stranded. Those are the 2 lessons that I learned. The solutions to these problems that I would advocate as governor would be these. First, I would call for relaxation of the requirements that say that every I has to be dotted and every T has to be crossed in order for a bill to get paid. And I would ensure that there are never any legitimate bills that go unpaid. What happens if a company that serves the disabled goes out of business because of this? If they fail, those that they serve, you, also fail. And a government that is concerned about its citizens should never, ever let that happen. The second thing that I would do, the second solution, would be to fund organizations as startups that would serve as AAA serves stranded motorists. So these organizations would be there for the disabled community when they get stranded. The disabled community has to know that help is on the way when they become stranded. The second thing I want to talk about today and I've mentioned at the convention, and it bears repeating. I want you to all know that I believe in and I staunchly defend the sanctity of life, the lives of all, but most especially the life of the disabled. As you well know, the disabled have special challenges, but they also face special discriminations. When a disability is discovered in a developing child yet unborn, their risk for abortion goes up dramatically, dramatically. We know that 80 to 90% of children with Down syndrome are aborted. As tragic and as awful as this is, there is wonderful hope for the unborn with disabilities. There is a new area. It's called fetal surgery. It has developed, and it is doing absolutely wonderful things for the unborn with disabilities. Disabilities like spina bifida and tumors and other serious disabilities are being treated, and they're being treated with increasing success. The problem is there are only 3 facilities in the country that deal with fetal surgery. One is Vanderbilt, it's down in Tennessee. The other is Children's Hospital in Philadelphia. And the last one is the University of California in San Francisco. What does that mean for patients to travel to these facilities? On average, they travel 1,500 miles if they can afford to do so. For many, it's an impossibility to do so. So as governor, I would advocate for these wonderful medical facilities here in Massachusetts to embark upon and become leaders in this area for the disabled. Charlie Baker and all the other Democrats believe that health care is a right. I would say to them, follow the logic of your belief and acknowledge that the unborn who are rightly given health care enjoy that right because they share another right, the right to life. Follow the logic of your own belief. The other candidates have followed me here today. I challenge them to follow me and advocate for the disabled, unborn and born, so that they can enjoy life and enjoy life to the fullest. Thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Mark, thank you. As you know, sticking with healthcare, supports are needed to bolster access to basic health care for the disabled community. Transportation to health-related appointments is often a barrier to getting proper care. Patients with disabilities often need help to identify and access appropriate healthcare providers and services. So what, as governor, would you do to better communication solutions, public education programs, counselors for families perhaps, all of which would lead to a healthier Commonwealth?
Very good. Thank you, Gary. When I was looking at the websites to better educate myself about the disability issues, I found out that there are many lawsuits that the disabled community has against our local government, even here in Massachusetts. Why is that? Well, we're $129 billion in debt. And so, when the budgets are formulated, there's always trade-offs. Where does the limited amount of money go? So my solution, Gary, to this and many other issues is let's fill the coffers of state government by making a robust economy. It's all about jobs. We cannot fund the programs that are necessary for the disabled or any other segment of the population if we're $129 billion in debt and growing year by year. And so how do we do this? We bring jobs into Massachusetts as opposed to pushing them out. And I have a 4-point program to do just that. First, we lower the corporate income tax rate and make it comparable to those states to which we're driving businesses out. Secondly, we stop the overburdensome rules and regulations which do the same thing. Thirdly, we stop taxpayer funding of fad industries like evergreen solar. $58 million of your money was used to fund a company that in 2 years closed its doors, went to China, and 800 people lost their jobs. Fourth part, we eliminate the inventory tax. Only about 7 other states have an inventory tax. And what does that do for Massachusetts? You've heard the old adage about location, location, location in real estate. Well, look where Massachusetts is located. We are in the center of New England. 3 states to our north, 2 to our south, and New York is to our left. By the way, I always want to keep New York to the left of Massachusetts. What does this mean for inventory or distribution centers? It's a haven for them. They want to be in the center of a locality, and Massachusetts is. It would bring distribution centers in, and it would create jobs in transportation, logistics, material handling, administration. We take people off unemployment, put them on the payroll, and the state coffers go up because of the revenue from income taxes.
Mark, as you know, accessibility goes well beyond ramps and sidewalk cuts. In addition to physical access to public places, what goes on inside those buildings must also be made accessible. So what would you do as governor, while Massachusetts does have some laws on the books that go beyond what the ADA has legislated, what would you do to make materials, media, online resources, and such more available? And also, what would you do to make sure that the laws are enforced?
Thanks again, Gary. Just today, I learned something about the access for disabled individuals. I have a friend who I brought here today, and he came to my house first, and he was not able to manage the stairs from our cellar up to the first floor, and so he had to wait in the cellar as I got ready. And I didn't feel too happy about that, but I wasn't even aware of it until it happened just today. I am an advocate, and I'm going to see how this plays in the disabled community. I am an advocate for having a special task force that goes out and looks at problems areas in transportation for motor vehicles, the potholes and the bridges and such. I think it goes beyond just educating people about what the laws are and what should be done. I think each local community should have a task force like that. And by the way, I've been out on the stump, and when I come to public buildings, whether it be the libraries or the town halls, it seems like they've done a good job. There's work still to be done, but they've done a good job. I think we need to have a task force that identifies those areas that are still need work on and have them go out and accomplish that. And the state, as a state, should fund those local areas as well.
This is a question from the audience. It goes back to your stance as a right-to-life candidate. And as you know, there are tremendous advances, as you mentioned, with fetal surgeries. Those don't always alleviate the disability, take care of all the problems, and there are many children who are born with disabilities and go on to grow up and deal with the disabilities throughout their lives. The costs of raising a disabled child are incredible. This person would like to know, what would you do about the tough choices that parents have to make between a job and having to stay home and care for a multiply disabled child because there is not assistance available?
Right. Thank you. I'm going to tell a little story. I've been unemployed a number of times, and quite a few of them came around Christmas time. My children are not disabled, but all families have to make choices with regard to finances. And I didn't love my children any less because I couldn't get them the things that I would have wanted to get them at Christmas time. And so a family that raises a special needs child, the costs of doing so are greater than that for someone without special needs. But it's not all about the money. I honestly believe that love rules the day. And if we can't provide financially the things that we would want to do, you know, we make it up in caring It doesn't cost, to being with someone, either by their bedside or making their meals or changing them or providing for them in other ways other than financial. And I think love rules the day. And I think sometimes we can't get hung up in the fact that we can't provide financially those things that we think would make a better life for the person, but we just love them all the more.
Mark, the question from the audience, what is your stance on cuts in mental health funding? There are many facilities that are being closed, and that leaves people who cannot afford private care unable to get services.
Yeah. Obviously, I'm against any cuts in any of these programs, and it goes back to funding the state coffers through an increased economy. That's the general answer. The specific answer, I have a brother-in-law. He is 64 this year, and when he was born, they said he wouldn't live past 30. He's deaf, and he has a mental disability, and he's cared for in a group home, and his care is absolutely wonderful. But it's so dependent on the caregiver. This woman is just a fantastic person. But I feel like his care wouldn't be at the level that it's at if it wasn't for her. And I don't think this type of care should be dependent on the caregiver. We need to have programs fully funded that allow for that type of care across the board. And again, it begins with a robust economy, filling the coffers at the State House so we don't have to pick and choose which programs get cut.
Mark, this is a question asking about your position on gun legislation. Often people with mental health conditions have been scapegoated. There have been a number of certainly horrific school and mass shootings. They also would like to know your position on assisted outpatient treatment, also known as involuntary outpatient commitment.
Two quite different questions there. The story about where I come up with my position on guns. My dad owned a shotgun and 2 handguns. And I remember as a little boy him telling me a story of my uncle who committed suicide using a gun, and my cousin who did the same thing. And he taught me how to respect guns and handle them. I was a manager at Savage Arms out in Westfield, Mass. that makes rifles and shotguns. I built my own shotgun. And when I went to get my FID card, if any of you have them, you'd have the same experience. Massachusetts has some of the strictest gun laws in the state. And I counted the number of laws that if you broke any one of those, you couldn't own a gun legally in Massachusetts. At the time when I got my FID card, probably 10 years ago, that list was 98. I'm sure it's well over 100. And so what I tell people, the moral of the story, if you want to find a good neighbor, find yourself a law-abiding gun owner. Why? Because they have to be squeaky clean. Now, not everyone who has a gun is a law-abiding gun owner. So the problem is now we have to enforce the laws, and those who break the law with a gun, I think they get put away for a very, very, very long time, so they can't come back out and commit those same crimes. That's my view on guns, and I apologize. The second
Involuntary outpatient commitment.
Yeah, I believe that we want to have people live on their own, and I don't think it should be involuntary. I think that there needs to be an assessment done, and we do the best we can. And there are always going to be mistakes made in this regard, but I don't like the idea of having this type of thing done involuntarily.
Mark, thank you very much for taking the time to join us here this afternoon. We appreciate it. Again, a short break. We welcome your questions and appreciate it if you would submit them. There are those around the room and in the back that can assist you if you need any help, either a card to write your question or you need some help in writing it on the card. Our remaining 3 candidates are Charlie Baker, Steve Grossman, and Martha Coakley. And so we will be back in about 4 minutes. Thank you. Thank you again for being here today, and it is my pleasure to call to the podium Charlie Baker. Charlie?
Trying to turn off my phone here.
I'm going to hold that over, Gary.
Am I allowed to take, can you guys hear me? Okay. I also would like to stand in front of the podium, if you don't mind. I hope that doesn't screw you up too much. Well, first of all, thank you all for coming out today. I know that you're spending a day here with 7 candidates who are all running for governor. That's a long, long day. But you're good to be here, and the issues that you're concerned about are important ones that deserve this kind of conversation. For those of you who don't know much about me, I thought I'd just give you a little bit about my background and then talk a little bit about some of the issues that you confront and deal with every day and what some of my thoughts are on that. And then I look forward to the Q&A. So I'm a Massachusetts kid. I grew up in Needham. I attended schools here. I had a professional career in which I ultimately spent time working in the Bill Weld and Paul Cellucci administration in the 1990s. I was Undersecretary and then Secretary of Health and Human Services in the 1990s, and then Secretary of Administration and Finance. I left state government in the late 90s to head a physicians group called Harvard Vanguard Medical Associates. And then I got kind of a promotion when the parent company, Harvard Pilgrim, got into terrible trouble financially. Actually went into receivership, and a lot of people thought it was going to go out of business. But we put together a great team, and over the course of the next several years, turned it around. And for the last 7 years I was at Harvard Pilgrim, it was the #1 ranked plan in the country for member satisfaction and clinical effectiveness. Let me just talk a little bit about my experience as Secretary of Health and Human Services, because I think that's probably most appropriate to all of you. I had 3 big concerns when I was Secretary, and I think those concerns that I had then are still issues today. One of them was that as a general rule, we didn't do a very good job of coordinating our programming or our activity between and among agencies within the Secretariat. So if you were part of a family that dealt with 4 or 5 different agencies in Health and Human Services, which wasn't that unusual, we did not do a particularly good job of thinking about how to serve your needs in a holistic way. And that was also true for many of the folks that we worked with in the disability community. And it especially was a problem and an issue when it came to trying to connect folks with disabilities with employment. Second big issue, I never did figure out how to solve or create the right kind of connection between what we were doing in Health and Human Services and what local communities were doing with respect to Chapter 766 and the special ed programming. I get the fact that you're talking about state government on the one hand and local government on the other. But if you're somebody who's working either as a caregiver or a client of the state and local government, for you, it doesn't much matter if state and local government have a hard time working together. What you feel is the impact of that, which in many cases was confusing, complicated, and not particularly positive. And the third thing I wanted to mention was we did spend some time back then, and this was a long time ago, I'm talking almost 20 years, talking about self-directed care. And we tried some modest demonstrations with respect to that, and we found some interest in that among some folks in the advocacy and the client community. But it didn't really go that far, and it didn't take off, in part because I think a lot of the support service and frankly the technology that needed to be there to help people engage in a self-directed approach to care and support just didn't exist at that point in time. It's 20 years later. a lot of the capability that didn't exist then does exist now. There are a number of states that have moved pretty enthusiastically toward a system that provides opportunities for people with disabilities to get more into a self-directed approach to care and service and support on their behalf. And I think that's something that Massachusetts should consider. And as governor, what I would ask all of you is if you would be willing to engage in a conversation with me and my administration about how we might go about making, for those who are interested in pursuing that type of an approach, a more self-directed care and service and support approach than the traditional one we use now, which is the state and the locals have a whole bunch of things they can do, and then people have to figure out how they fit into those. I think in some respects that's backwards. I think the way this program ought to work is somebody has a set of things they'd like to accomplish, and they're looking for folks to help them do that, whether that's volunteer work or paid employment or other sorts of activities. And what we ought to do is at least try and figure out if there isn't a way to help them have the opportunity to engage more directly in how we get from here to there with respect to that. The two other things I'll say, and then I'll look forward to the Q&A. The first is, when I was at Health and Human Services, some of the most rewarding time I spent was actually in the clubhouses at DMH. Now, the clubhouses back then were kind of a new concept, because I am talking 20 years ago. But the thing I loved the most about the clubhouses is they were client-directed, they were client-driven, they were client-led, they were in the community, and on the wall inside each clubhouse I visited, there's a big chalkboard, because this was back in the days before whiteboards. And on that chalkboard would be sort of the activity schedule for everybody who was a member that day, where they would be going to work, where they would be going to volunteer, where they would be going for class, whatever it happened to be. And for me, I remember saying at the time, this is a movement I can get behind and I can support. And we put a ton of effort and energy into expanding those programs over that period of time. Then I left state government and I went on to do some other stuff and continued to work in healthcare. And then as I got back into this race, I got invited earlier this year to go to what apparently was the annual gala or the annual celebration for the clubhouses in Massachusetts up at the State House. And there were about 400 employers there, about 20 clubhouses, and a ton of their leaders, which in many cases were clients. And we spent a couple hours celebrating how much those programs had grown and succeeded in connecting people with disabilities to work over the course of the last 20 years. Now for me, what that said was that sometimes this stuff does move in the right direction, and it may take a long time to get there. But I would love to see us find a way to find more opportunities for people with disabilities to work, volunteer, and engage in the communities that they live in. Because we have succeeded for the most part in supporting an agenda and an idea that folks with disabilities should be able to live in the community and live on their own. But the next step in my mind in that one is we've got to come up with strategies and solutions to help folks find opportunity to work, volunteer, participate in those communities in which they now live. And I look forward to the Q&A, and thank you very much for the chance to be here today, and I wish you all the very best.
Charlie, let's talk a little bit about employment. As you well know, the disabled community is overrepresented among the unemployed. Massachusetts residents with disabilities certainly want to work. What steps will you and your administration take to increase the level of employment for state employees with disabilities from its current level of 3% to the state's goal of 12%?
State employees? That means they're already working?
Increase the level of employment for state, to increase the level of employees in state jobs from the current level of 3%.
Let me talk about two parts to that question. The first part is just what can we do to actually create, enhance and improve the level of employment, period, okay? What I can tell you I was doing as governor is a couple things. The first is I would like to model a state initiative around what the folks at Perkins are doing, which is to get a bunch of folks who are part of the private employer community to engage more directly with Perkins, which I think is a great idea and a great way to start the conversation. I think one role the state can play is to do something similar. The state does business with hundreds, if not thousands, of employers around the Commonwealth, okay? And the state is a very important player for many of those employers. I think there's an imminent or an easy opportunity for the Commonwealth to incorporate into its process of dealing with those folks that it contracts with some nudges, some encouragement, some engagement around making sure that if there are opportunities for those folks to bring folks with disabilities into their organizations, that they take advantage of them. The two other things I think the state can do, I don't understand why we don't do any of what I would call sort of on-the-job training stuff with folks with disabilities, with employers. You know, on-the-job, when I was a kid, which admittedly now is a really long time ago, we used to do a lot of, on-the-job training was like standard operating procedure. It was the way somebody could find out if they wanted to do a certain job, and it was the way for an organization to figure out if they actually wanted to hire that person on a more permanent basis in the first place. We don't do that anymore, and I don't know why. And I would love to see us engage with a group of employers and a cast of folks in the disability community to create an on-the-job training program that could be used as an on-ramp to help folks move into the world of work. And maybe it starts as a volunteer position, maybe it starts as a paid position that's supported by the employer and by the Commonwealth. But the bottom line here is I think there are a lot of people with disabilities who could prove beyond any reasonable doubt that they are perfectly capable of working and performing and being a part of an organization. But we have got to figure out a way to make that first step happen, and I think on-the-job training would be a big way to do it. As far as the other question with respect to state government is concerned, I think that's something you got to run and manage out of your HR office, and you have to commit to improving that year over year. I mean, the numbers are the numbers are the numbers. So if it's at 3% now, you need to say that by the end of the first year of your administration, it'll be at 5%. At the end of the second year, it'll be at 7%. At the end of the third year, it'll be at 9%. At the end of the fourth year, it'll be at 12%. And then you gotta hold people accountable for it and go get it. Now that also means working aggressively with many of the folks in this room and many of the folks who aren't in this room, who work with and represent the disability community, to make sure that we have access to candidates. You know, you could use the same on-the-job training model for that I was talking about with respect to the private sector as well. But we would need to work with you to make sure we had people who could interview for and accept and take jobs as they became available. But I think that's one where, if you're asking me if I'd make a commitment to try to get to 12% by the end of the first term, my answer is yes.
Charlie, I think this is a fairly easy question to answer. But
Well,
I'll
then
let you be the judge.
You can answer it, Gary.
When you're governor, will you have the interpreter next to you during emergency announcements?
You mean as opposed to standing in front of me or behind me?
Or as opposed to perhaps in a box, so
Okay,
interpreting from somewhere else?
Yeah, my answer to that would be very simple, which is as long as it's possible, logistically, given the timing that's involved. I mean, if you're talking about emergencies here, there may not be a heck of a lot of time to make that sort of thing work, and you don't want to lose the ability to have somebody performing that service either online or on TV or whatever it happens to be. But if we can make that work, logistically, I'm all in. If we can't make it work, we got to come up with an alternative.
Charlie, you mentioned getting people, the disabled community, out into the community. How will you go about supporting independent living centers and programs?
I guess what I would say to that is that I was a big fan of the independent living centers when I worked in Health and Human Services and worked in state government previously. I consider them to be an important part of our commitment to people with disabilities, and I believe they play a major role in helping people find opportunities, whether they're related to education or work or volunteer activities. And what I would say today, Gary, is that there's nothing that's happened over the last 20 years that's changed my view with respect to that. I was a big fan of them then, I'm a big fan of them now.
With regard to autism, would you continue to work with the Autism Commission started by Deval Patrick?
Yes, I have several friends who have autistic children, and I've spent many, many hours talking to them about what their life is like and what they have to invest. And I don't mean financially, I mean emotionally and logistically, to take care of their children and to make sure that their kids have an ability to make the most of the hand that they've been asked to play. And for many of these folks, it is the dominant factor in their life. There is simply nothing else. It sucks up all the time that, all the time that would be available to do practically anything else is sucked up by the commitment that they have to make and the work that they need to do to advocate for their kids and make sure their kids have the best opportunity they could possibly have to be successful. And when you talk about the kind of numbers that are involved in autism, if you think about the whole spectrum from one end to the other, it's a major issue, not just here but everywhere else. And I would absolutely commit to continuing to work with that commission because I think, frankly, a lot of the work on autism is ahead of us, not behind us.
With regard to special education funding, Charlie, schools, towns struggle to meet their budgets for schools every year. And special education is a significant portion for many towns. What do you see as the state's role in supporting special education? Specifically, the circuit breaker legislation, I believe when it came in, it was, the goal was 75%, and I think it was funded last year at 65%. Is there something that you would commit to in terms of getting it closer to that 75%?
So Gary just asked me like 5 questions in one. So I will do the best I can to answer all 5 of them. But one thing you should know, I'm the only candidate running for governor who's actually served in local government. All right? I was a member of my Board of Selectmen in Swampscott. And I used to say to people that the reason I served on the Board of Selectmen was because I didn't have the guts to run for school committee. That's way harder. But I know what it's like to try to put those budgets together at the local level, especially when you're dealing in a world in which state aid has been shrinking year after year after year. Over the course of the past 7 years, state spending has grown by about $6 billion, and over that same period of time, local aid to cities and towns, schools, police, fire, and all the rest, has dropped by $500 million. Now that translates into a lot, and by the way, there have been a whole series of new initiatives and new mandates that have been put on the backs of cities and towns over that period of time as well. That translates into tremendous difficulty at the local level when it comes to figuring out how to pay for all kinds of things, including schools. I'm the only candidate in this race who's committed to the idea that if state tax revenue grows by 5%, local aid to cities and towns has to grow by 5% as well. If local aid grows by 3%, if state tax revenue grows by 3%, local aid grows by 3%. If state tax revenue grows by 8%, local aid grows by 8%. We cannot be a great commonwealth if we continue to starve our cities and towns, because all we end up with on the other end of that is cuts in services and programs that are very close to home for people. So point number one, I don't think you'll find any candidate in the race who's more supportive of making sure that the Commonwealth cities and towns are adequately financed and supported than me. Question number, on the second part of your question, I think the goal over time ought to be to get the circuit breaker back to 75%, and I would support doing that, because that's where it was actually once upon a time. I think it was right around there about 10 years ago. That's another example of the numbers moving in the wrong direction and working against the ability of communities to do the kind of work they need to be able to do to support the people in their communities that they have, in many cases, the primary role of supporting.
Charlie, I want to thank you for your time. Appreciate you
Is that
coming here
it?
this
We're done?
afternoon. Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thanks. Thanks. Take care.
So we again will have a short break, and we'll see you on the other side. To the podium, our next gubernatorial candidate, and that would be State Treasurer Steve Grossman.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me here. I am delighted to see so many dear friends and look forward to a good conversation with you. I wanted to start with a story. When I was 8 or 9 years old, my father, whose name was Edgar Grossman, came home one day with a machine that I'd never seen before. And he took me and my sister Mary Ellen downstairs after dinner, and he showed us, and he said, "This is a sound scriber machine." I said, "Dad, what are you using it for?" He said, "Well, I'm going to record talking books for the blind." I said, "Well, how are you going to do that?" He said, "Well, I'm going to read into the microphone, and I'm going to come downstairs every night after dinner, and I'm going to read, and every time I do a few discs, the little green discs that many of you have handled over the years until the technology changed. And from the time I was 8 years old until I went off to college and took my own sound scriber machine, when I was old enough, I began to read and create talking books for the blind, working with the National Braille Press. My father became active in the National Braille Press. He became the chairman of the board of the National Braille Press, and only when he got stomach cancer back around 1980 did he give up that position. He lived many years longer than that, fortunately, but his relationship with the National Braille Press was always important to him, and I was very proud to have read into that machine and recorded countless books and pieces of nonfiction for those people who are blind and partially sighted, whose lifeline to reading and to literature in many ways was those discs. When I became chairman of the Massachusetts Democratic Party, having known a little bit about the disability community from my work with the National Braille Press, I asked one question of my dear friend Lorraine Greif. I said, "Lorraine, what are we doing to accommodate people with disabilities?" She said, "Nowhere near enough." I said, "Help me." So we did some things that made it easier for delegates with disabilities to go to state conventions to accommodate their needs, their disabilities. And we also changed the way we did our meetings and changed the location of meetings so that no one would be denied access or the ability to participate in a meeting because of their disability. A number of years later, I got a call from Bill Rader, who many of you know, and Bill said, "Steve, I want you to come over and talk to us. We've got a blindfold challenge race, a world-class race for people who are blind and partially sighted, 5K race, and we want you to help us." I said, "Bill, what do you need me to do?" He said, "Come on over and talk to us about it, because one of our biggest challenges, and you're in the business community, is that the business community, CEOs in the business community, really are not very welcoming to and are not doing much in the way of hiring people with disabilities, either people who are blind or partially sighted or with other disabilities. So I went over to the National Braille Press at 88 St. Stephen Street behind Symphony Hall, and we talked a little bit. And I said, I've got an idea. Let's create something called the CEO Blindfold Challenge. Let's recruit CEOs of companies to come and run. He said, well, you're going to do it yourself, aren't you? I said, absolutely. So I went out and trained on Commonwealth Avenue several times. I was tethered to somebody who was a guide, and I ran several CEO Blindfold Challenges, all as a way to dramatize what many of you came together this morning to talk to CEOs in the Boston area about. How do we get beyond the unwillingness or the lack of performance among business leaders and CEOs to hire people with all forms of disabilities? Because we all know what the unemployment rate is. It's much too high. Some have said it's as high as 65 or 70%. I wouldn't dispute that. We can do better, and it requires a governor working with the business community to work in concert to make that happen. I had occasion a couple of years later to go over to the Carroll Center one day, and I was introduced to a fellow who became a friend. His name is Brian Charlson, sitting in the second row over here, and he showed me, by demonstrating it with somebody who is blind, what technology has turned into and how people who are blind and partially sighted can participate actively in the workforce, and the things that they can do with technology of all kinds. It was an extraordinary moment, and I'm thrilled that you're here, Brian, and I'm thrilled to see what you've done. You are a pioneer, and you are somebody whom I have developed enormous respect for, what you've done to give so many people over the years the lifelines they need to work and to realize their full potential. When I became state treasurer, I picked up the phone the day after I became state treasurer and called a friend of mine. I had known her because of her leadership role in the marriage equality battle. Barbara L'Italian stood up to the Catholic Church and to a lot of other people who said, don't go there, Barbara, because she thought that equal justice under law were the four fundamental principles that this republic is based on. Equal justice under law. That's what the Americans with Disabilities Act is all about, equal justice under law. That's what the Olmsted Supreme Court decision in 1999 is all about, equal justice under law. Barbara and I sat together and I said, Barbara, I know you lost the election, I know you've been devastated by laws in the election, but life's got to go on, and how would you like to become Director of Government Affairs within the Treasury? Barbara said, I'd love to do it, but there's one stipulation. I said, what is it, Barbara? She said, you know the work that I've done on creating the Autism Commission, and Barbara's been the leading member of the legislature in the Autism Commission work over the years. She said, I need you to tell me that whatever time I need to take away from my job at Treasury to head up the Autism Commission, you'll give me, and you won't ever question it when I take time away. I said, Barbara, you've got it, whatever you need. And through Barbara's eyes, I learned about the autism spectrum. Through Barbara's eyes and by seeing her with her children. And I'm so proud of you, Barbara L'Italian, who's in the audience, that she went on to play such an important leadership role in the Autism Commission, working with the ARC, and now running, and I hope successfully, to become the next state senator from the district now represented by Barry Feingold, because we need Barbara L'Italian back in the legislature to represent people with disabilities, all people with disabilities, not just those on the autism spectrum. When I became treasurer, I created something called the Diversity and Outreach Council. Why? Because I wanted people from diverse backgrounds to be represented. I wanted to have a lifeline in terms of fresh and bold ideas. But I wasn't satisfied that it was simply about racial and ethnic diversity. I said, we need somebody on this council who represents the disability community. And I met an extraordinary woman by the name of Pam Fernandez. Some of you in the community may know her. And I said, Pam, I want you to join our council. She did, and she's been a powerful voice and an advocate. She said one day, Steve, you've created something called the Small Business Banking Partnership. It's about small business loans to diverse communities, to people of color, to immigrants, to women, to veterans. How about having a forum, a roundtable discussion, and some of you may have participated, and let's talk about employment and small business growth and economic development, and how people with disabilities who want to run companies, who want to grow companies, who want to partner, who want to create jobs, who want to realize their full potential, who want to build their families up, and who want to realize their dreams of entrepreneurship. No one in the disability community should be denied their dream of entrepreneurship. If they want to do it, then we in government should help support that, and the Small Business Banking Partnership has been dedicated to that. And we had a 3-hour roundtable discussion, an extraordinary event. I didn't say a word, really. I listened. My father once said, Steve, you were born with one mouth and 2 ears. Not a bad idea to be a better listener than talker. And I learned so much that day from so many people in the disability community. And finally, I have a colleague here whose name is John Ostrowski. We put together a little paper called Ending Discrimination Against People with Disabilities. With apologies to those who are blind and partially sighted and who won't be able to read this document, we're going to have a copy of this document for all of you to be able to read and ask questions about. And frankly, I'm here today not only to give you answers to your questions and to engage in a dialogue, but I'm also here to invite you to participate in our campaign for governor. Because when I'm governor of the Commonwealth, as I said at the convention, and I was talking to one of the delegates here who's sitting in the 3rd row, and I said, you know, I didn't hear anybody except for me talk about people with disabilities at the convention. You had the Democratic Party of the state coming together in a convention with 5,000 delegates, and it would seem to me, as I said in my speech, and it wasn't a long reference, but at least it referred to the disability community and said, I look forward to partnering with the disability community in so many ways as governor, because the role of governor, working with the business community, working with nonprofits, making sure that Chapter 257 is fully funded so that those service provider organizations who have been left out, I mean, we promised full funding and new contracts to be negotiated back in 2010. The can was kicked down the road to 2012, now to 2014. I'm glad the governor put some more money into Chapter 257 contracts this year. We have an obligation to nonprofits who aren't able to compensate their employees appropriately, who aren't able to make ends meet, because we have not made that commitment and honored that commitment. So finally, my theme of the campaign is pretty simple. My goal as governor is to build one Commonwealth that levels the playing field and leaves no one behind. I look forward to your advice. I look forward to your counsel. I look forward to your partnership between now and the primary, between now and the election on November 4th. When I'm governor-elect, many of you will be sitting at the table with me thinking through, how do we deal with the challenges that face us? How are we going to make this state a foremost state in America in terms of working with people with disabilities? We've got a pretty good foundation on which to build. Let's take it to the next level. I'm never satisfied. You're never satisfied. I look forward to the rest of this conversation. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Steve, I have some questions here from the audience that I'd like to pose to you. This one we have asked to most of the gubernatorial candidates around employment. Massachusetts residents with disabilities certainly want to work, as you well know. What steps will you take to increase the level of employment for state employees with disabilities? That level is currently about 3% of state employees are employees with disabilities, to the state's goal of 12%.
Well, again, I like to build on a track record. My father used to say, words are words and promises are promises, but only performance is reality. People in political campaigns will promise you everything that they can think of to get your support and to get your vote. So I think it's important to fall back on what you've actually done. What have you done that would indicate that you have done something truly revolutionary or pioneering in your current job that would indicate the kind of hiring practices that you would engage in as governor? So as state treasurer, I'm responsible for about 750 people. When I became treasurer, I said to Jesse St. Cyr, first time, by the way, an employment specialist, a lawyer with an employment background, was hired to be head of human resources. Jesse St. Cyr is now our deputy treasurer, one of 5 deputies. I said, Jesse, I want you to look more broadly than we currently look. Currently, we just post jobs. A job comes up, you post the jobs on the computer, deadline comes, you look at the resumes, you pick the best person, hopefully, and you hire that person. And frankly, that's not good enough. When I became treasurer, I stood up in front of the people of Massachusetts and I said two things. I said, first, I want to hire the best person for every job. And we filled several hundred jobs over the last few years. Second, I want hiring to represent the diversity of the society in which we live. So Jesse St. Cyr has tried, not only at my direction, but because it's good common sense, to reach out to non-traditional organizations and institutions, to reach out to organizations in diverse communities, to reach out to organizations that serves people with disabilities. And while I can't give you, and I'd like to come back to you on this one, I can't give you exact numbers in terms of the hiring that we've done at Treasury. I can tell you that reaching out to organizations and institutions and individuals in a variety of communities, including the disability community, has resulted in some fundamental changes in our hiring practices. So what I would hope each one of you would do, and each of the organizations that are represented here, and the dozens and dozens of organizations that aren't here, through the Providers Council and others that aren't here, but that want to be part of this dialogue, to help me set up a mechanism by which every time we have a job within state government, every time we have a job, the distribution list for that job posting is sent out to each of you, to your executive directors, to your board members, so that you have an opportunity to make suggestions, to make references, to send us resumes, to pick up the phone and call us and say, I've got the right person for that job. I've got the person with the right qualifications and criteria. If we do things the same way we've been doing for many, many years, just posting jobs and picking the one that we find that looks the right person, we're never going to make the progress and never get beyond the 3%. If we are truly willing to be open and accessible and comprehensive in terms of the nonprofit organizations and leaders within the community who have ideas because they have the finger on the pulse of the community, then I think we can fundamentally change we do our hiring around people with disabilities, around people of color, around people in all parts of the community who have been left out and left behind for too long from those employment opportunities.
Thank you, Steve. Steve, you had mentioned a roundtable discussion that took place a couple of years ago, and there are many people in this room, probably, or some people in this room who are in attendance, and this question comes, I think, from one of those, and they were also energized by the discussion that went on around that table, and they remembered that you pledged to continue the discussions and hope to have a meeting every 3 to 4 months. So far, it hasn't happened, so they are wondering what happened to that idea.
Well, we actually have a meeting coming up of our Diversity and Outreach Council next week, and that's one of the topics on the agenda for the conversation. But I tell you the conversations we have had, because this was about entrepreneurship and small business growth and economic development. It was about how do we make capital available to people who would like to be in business, whether they're in partnership with somebody else or whether they're on their own, to make small business opportunities grow. Because small businesses are the job creators in our society. Most of the jobs are created by those businesses, by those startup companies and by those emerging growth companies. So what we have done is we have reached out to the bankers. What the Small Business Banking Partnership was created, just a little bit of background for those who weren't there, 3.5 years ago. I asked one question when I became state treasurer. I said, where are our state's deposits? Where's our money? And I found out that 60% of that money was sitting in banks in Europe, Australia, and Asia. I said, something's wrong with that picture. Let's bring that money back to Massachusetts. Let's bring that money into small businesses through the banks that we have. So we offered to every community bank in Massachusetts, we offered to those banks the opportunity to take up to $10 million of deposits. We said, you have to pay us a competitive interest rate, and you must loan the money to small businesses of all kinds. And so after that conversation, we reached out to the bankers and we said, look, we want you to focus on businesses that are small, but we want you to focus on all business owners. We want you to focus on all entrepreneurs. If businesses come in that are owned by people of color, immigrants, people with disabilities, veterans, we want you to be responsive to that. We don't establish quotas, but it's all about sensitizing and giving some sense, some understanding that our priorities and our values are about making sure that any business owner, any entrepreneur, any person who has a good idea deserves at least a conversation with a banker about access to capital. Because the number one issue that I heard at that roundtable discussion was access to capital and opportunity. They sent me away because they said I have a disability. They didn't even have to say it. I knew when I was sent away that the reason that I was sent away was not because I don't have a good idea, not because I can't make a profit, not because a loan wouldn't be made wisely and be repaid, but because they just sent me away, and I knew the reason why I was sent away. And I think the more we can do as leaders in government, particularly a governor, to lay down a moral and economic principle that anyone, no matter who you are, who has a good idea and has an idea that can be funded through a bank or through a financial institution, should be able to compete with those funds. That's what equal justice to me means, and that's what we plan to talk about a little bit more. But the bankers understand what our principles are. We don't require the banks to say how many loans were made to businesses owned by people of color, immigrants, people with disabilities, and veterans, but it is something that we do try to reinforce as best we can. Again, as governor, when you oversee a government with 85,000 employees, 85,000, a $36 billion budget, the opportunity you have to play a leadership role to fundamentally change the dialogue and the debate is pretty significant.
Let's try and squeeze in a couple of more questions in the time that we have. What is your opinion of a tax advantage savings plan for individuals with disabilities and their families, similar to a 529 college savings account, but could be used towards housing and perhaps other extraordinary housing or perhaps other extraordinary expenses?
I think it's a good idea. Maybe you could, if this is an idea that has already been offered, whether it's in legislation or otherwise, and hasn't made it through the legislative process, or this is simply an idea that many in the community have come up with as a way to enhance people's ability to find housing and other things. But I think it's a terrific idea, and if there's some reason why it wouldn't fly legislatively, I'd like to know why, but that's something that, on first blush, I would be prepared not only to support and to advocate for, and if we could find somebody in the legislature, maybe Barbara L'Italian when she becomes state senator from Andover and Lawrence, maybe if Barbara sponsors it, I can work with her on it. But I see no reason why that isn't a good common sense idea whose time is long past and should come.
All right, Stephen, I think one more. This, obviously, it's an emotional question coming from the disabled community. What is your position on assisted suicide?
On what?
Assisted suicide.
So I was asked this question during the debate about the ballot question a few years ago, and frankly, I admitted to being unsure about this issue. I admitted to being ambivalent about the issue. I've read a great deal about it, and I haven't, to be candid with you, come to kind of a full realization of whether I'm yet ready to support it. I understand and have heard from many people who have given this a lot of thought, who have done a lot of research in it. This is an entirely appropriate and right thing to do. I'm certainly open to it and open to considering it and open to potentially supporting it. I'd like to hear from more people who have dealt with it, physicians, academics, and others who would be able to bring some light to the discussion and not just heat. But it's an idea that I'm entirely open to without yet having taken a strong and unequivocal position on it.
Treasurer Grossman, we appreciate your time. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Let me just end by making a request. I'm Steve Grossman. I'm also stevegrossman.com. That's our website. And we are a campaign that believes that the next governor of Massachusetts will be the candidate who is able to build an army of activists and sustain that. No Democratic governor from Michael Dukakis 40 years ago to Deval Patrick has been elected governor without the energy, passion, and excitement of activists all over the Commonwealth. The energy that I see and feel and can touch in this room, representing thousands, tens of thousands, and more people in this Commonwealth who want a governor who's going to work with you hand in glove and to be a good listener, who's going to be inviting you into his office to have these dialogues, who's going to make a commitment today to make you part of a transition team, to make sure that we deal with the challenges and opportunities, because I'm an optimist, and I believe that if we deal with challenges and opportunities and try to look for employment and employment opportunities and small business opportunities as the gateway to the kind of economic well-being that the disability community has not had and has sought and has never found successfully executed. That's what I'm hoping to achieve. So if there's anyone here who wants to be involved in our campaign, email me. My personal email address is steve@stevegrossman.com. I return all my emails. I return all my phone calls. I look forward to working with you. Thank you so much for having me.
This next break will be pretty short. Our final gubernatorial candidate to address you this afternoon will be Martha Coakley. Well, thank you again for joining us today. We really appreciate your attendance and all of your questions. And our final candidate for the day is Attorney General Martha Coakley. Martha.
So thank you, Gary, and thanks to all of you on this beautiful kind of muggy day for being here. It's always a pleasure to come back to Perkins, and I want to thank Perkins for hosting all of the candidates here for our opportunity to meet with you today. I know I've got some time. I'm going to speak relatively briefly because I'm interested in hearing from you and hearing from your questions. A friend of mine who's a teacher says that a lecture is a long answer to a question nobody asked. And part of the fun of running for governor in this wonderful state is our opportunity not just to be with each other, as we've learned through this campaign and will continue to, but hearing from folks all over the state about what's working, what isn't working, how can we do better, and most importantly, how can we be partners with you moving forward on the issues that are of particular interest to you and the disability community. I had the opportunity when I came in as Attorney General to move from just doing the investigation and enforcement of the criminal law. And part of the fun of being Attorney General was looking at the wide range of opportunities and challenges we had on the civil side, enforcing our civil law, particularly against discrimination of all kinds. And our work, particularly in our Civil Rights Division, but not just in that division, has always been informed by our desire, and I think our obligation, to promote policies and to promote enforcement that allows for individuals in the Commonwealth to thrive. And that is true whether we are looking at hearing impaired or sight impaired or the developmentally disabled from brain injury, for instance. And our mission in the office has really been to move beyond that also, to not just look about ending discrimination, but how do we promote inclusion? How do we make, particularly now that we have new technologies, we have new ways to approach life, make sure that everybody in the Commonwealth has access and ability to appreciate life to the fullest. And so, of course, we bring cases in our office against landlords who discriminate against those who are physically disabled. And as we have historically, making sure that landlords and others who own property make sure that people can get in and out of their property. Particularly, it was interesting a year ago as we worked with many of the survivors of the marathon bombings, a whole new group of people who were in wheelchairs, who were disabled, and who all of a sudden needed some very quick and immediate help to get in and out of where they lived. And we worked with them to make sure they were going to have access and continue to work with them to make sure they have the opportunities to live. And as we look at, obviously, employment, housing, transportation, all the areas where so many folks in the Commonwealth take for granted how easy it can be, but for people who are physically disabled, the challenges still remain enormous. And as we've looked at the physical access issues, we've also tried to expand our ability to use technology to include people. So I was pleased to come to Perkins a few years ago now to announce our settlement with Apple around the iTunes access issue, to make sure that those who were sight impaired were going to have the same access to iTunes University that those who can see had. And the joy on the look of the faces of the students, particularly when they had access to that, was something to behold. So not only is our work required by the law, it's also encouraging to us to see what we are able to do by promoting those policies and enforcement. Not too long after that, our Civil Rights Division also announced a settlement with 3 major movie theaters to make sure that for those who were hearing impaired, that experience of going to a movie with your child or your spouse could now be shared by families that before that had not been able to do it. And so using technology and putting pressure on and talking to those who develop technology, particularly around the arts, to say, let's make this available to everybody, has been one of the more fun things we've been able to do in the Attorney General's office, and we will continue to do that. I know that one of our goals has to continue to be to make sure that even as we come out of this recession, and believe me, I understand that housing and transportation is difficult for many people in the Commonwealth. I know that the challenges are compounded and even more difficult for those who are physically disabled, and we need to continue to try our best to make sure that we include people in all of those opportunities, the things that, again, that many of us take for granted. So certainly my experience as Attorney General, and I hope as your next governor, will lead me to work both with officials in my administration, but also with you, with the disability community, to make sure that we are aware of the challenges, both individually, that you face one-on-one, and what you face as groups, that the state in our buildings and our employment, that we provide for better access, and we encourage and enforce where we can the need for others in the state to do it. So many of you may know that one of the things we've also done in the Attorney General's office was bring suits against Wall Street for, as I've said, taking our money, gambling with it, losing it, and then leaving us with the mess behind in the foreclosure crisis, foreclosing on people they'd sold predatory loans to. And what we found was, as we've worked to keep 30,000 people in their homes, prevent unnecessary foreclosures, one of the things we did was take some of the money we recovered and give it to legal services, those civil services that provide representation for people across the Commonwealth in areas that we could not represent them directly. For instance, someone might be foreclosed upon, but they had an issue because of a family divorce or because there were other title issues with the property. What we believed and what I think we have seen happen is that by providing additional civil legal services, we helped reinvigorate a structure, frankly, in Massachusetts that has been cut, has not been funded, that can, I think, if the state provides those resources, and we recognize the value of providing, particularly for those who don't necessarily come to the attention of the AG's office, but who have a problem with a landlord or with employment, that you would have access to greater civil legal services. I know that many of the issues are individual and need individual representation. One of the things I look forward to as governor is continuing to provide access to courts and legal services by providing that representation, particularly for those who are discriminated against. Where the laws protect you on the federal and state level, unless you have a lawyer or someone who can advocate for you, sometimes those laws really don't mean that much. In terms of health care, we've worked hard to try and bring costs down, to look towards more prevention. And one of the things that I know the state has done since the fall of 2013 is look for coordinated care around those who need Medicare and Mass Health. I'm a big believer that for folks where we can provide better case management for your health care and other services you need, we will be doing better at the state level, particularly around health care and insurance issues. So I'd like to see how that's working and see if we can and should do better around providing care coordination. In addition to that, I just believe that as this economy turns around, and I hope that it is turning around, I've said, and I say this on the trail, it should turn around for everybody, including everybody in Massachusetts who works hard every day to be part of a family, to work, to bring your kids up, to support your families. And our job in the AG's office, and I believe my job as governor, to make Massachusetts as inclusive as we can be. We need to work with you and hear how we can do that, but I am committed to make that happen. And I believe that Massachusetts can be prosperous and fair and that includes giving everybody access to what we have to offer here. And thank you for your attention today, and I'd be delighted to get questions and comments from folks. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney General. I'm going to be asking you the questions that were submitted by the folks in attendance here. You had just mentioned some of the people in the Commonwealth who are dual eligible under Mass Health and Medicaid, and Medicare, rather. So One Care is a new program for people on Mass Health and Medicare. So far, Partners and Spalding have refused to participate. And so the question is, would this be part of your settlement agreement with Partners?
It is not. I can tell you that particular piece is not, because the issue around the acquisition of South Shore Hospital was pretty much restricted to antitrust law. But I will just say that if that continues to be an issue, we're happy to look at that under our authority under Chapter 93A and our other ability to enforce what should be fairness and fair treatment. And so if we are going to have that program, which makes sense to me, managing, and certainly both of those institutions claim to be interested in moving towards better accountability, we will try gently, and if that doesn't work, we will use whatever the authority we have to make sure that they do. And that is one of the issues, that we have a variety of providers around the state, and frankly, we should be getting a base level at which they all should be agreeing to participate in something like One Care. And I am interested in seeing, since it's a relatively new program, how it's working, how we can do better with it, and frankly, to make sure that everybody should be, who should be participating is participating.
This question was submitted by a gentleman, Juan Figueroa, out of Holyoke, specifically for you. If you become governor of Massachusetts, would you continue to pay disabled workers sub-minimum wages, or would you attempt to repeal any laws in the Commonwealth that allow certificates to employers that allow them to continue paying disabled workers sub-minimum wages?
The issue of fair pay for everybody is a huge one, and I appreciate that. I think we've come some ways in understanding that the ability to work and be treated fairly, to be treated with dignity, is one that is very important to this community. And just as I was at the State House today to look at raising the minimum wage to $11 by 2016, starting in January, I believe that the ability, since over 80% of physically disabled people in Massachusetts remain unemployed, and there is still stigma and lack of access, that continuing programs like that continue that stigma. That I think what we need to do is look at getting employers and making sure that the Commonwealth is fair in providing for access to work, good work, training for people who want it, and making sure that people are paid fairly.
In terms of employing those in the disabled community within state government, as you well know, Massachusetts residents who are disabled want to work. What steps would you take to increase the level of employment for state employees? That level is currently around 3% of state employees, and I think that the state's stated goal was 12%. So what steps would you take to increase that level?
Well, in being able to, first of all, provide the access to people who do want to work and understand what's available in terms of what we have, and how do we accommodate for those who need accommodation, whether it's physical or in instances, I'm thinking of an attorney in our office who is sight impaired, but he has a paralegal who works with him fair time. He's a terrific lawyer, and we're delighted that he works with us. I know that from my experience, both as a DA and a attorney general, attorneys with disabilities who have wheelchairs, for instance, we have tried to make every accommodation to access to courts, access to our facilities. And so we have to look first, what are the barriers that we still have in our office buildings, many of which purport to be accessible and aren't. I know we battled for a long time with the State House and the courts around providing the access that the law requires. So we have to look at what the barriers are, and then I think we have to reach out to the community with advocacy groups like those of you who are here to say exactly that question. These are jobs we have available. What is it, the gap between those who want to work and the skill set that there and the barriers that remain, and how do we increase that percentage? The best way we can do that, I think, is working actually with the advocacy groups and community members to say, what is it that we do? And I know in the Attorney General's office, about half of us are lawyers, but we have paralegals, investigators. Certainly across the state, we have a much wider range of agencies and employment that we should be more aggressive on looking at employing, and also providing incentive to those with whom we contract, those with whom we work, and frankly, in all of our communities, working as I think we move the economy forward region by region. There should be an incentive for us in those communities to get those numbers up across Massachusetts, whether it's in cities or looking to large employers at first, I think, who I think when asked are often willing and able to help. And the state should take a lead in making them partners in this, increasing the numbers of people who can and will be employed in the future.
This question, 1 in 11 Bay Staters live with hearing loss, which means about 9% of voters are not getting full access to political discourse in Massachusetts. Would you commit to providing captions for your media and live events?
So we should, and it is an interesting statistic, and I'm particularly thinking again of the number of people just after the marathon bombings who did not go to hospitals or get treatment, but now have permanent hearing loss. It's an extraordinary number of people, many of whom now have lost their jobs, their relationships have suffered, and so again, I am struck by how we often take for granted the ability to see or hear until it's taken away. And I know that we should be providing that access, and we know that that technology is available. And the one thing that I found interesting is that it was initially something that people said is going to be too expensive. We can't develop this technology. But every time we have done that, we find that it generally provides access to more people. That ability to provide captions, for instance, is now a great economic driver for public restaurants and bars because you can leave that up. And so my belief is that when we move forward on ways to accommodate people, to make access available, we all benefit from that, directly and indirectly. And so yes, we had not been asked that before, but we should make every effort to include those in our ads. I hope that I'm going to have enough money to put ads on TV, but if we do, we will look at including that, the captions.
And then when you do become governor, would you have captions for your live events?
I certainly will. And I know that as we have a signer today, we should be looking at all of that, so that particularly around political speech and political discourse, that's about inclusion, and that's about making sure people are able to hear, participate, and we should be doing that as a matter of course.
You've mentioned the economy, certainly in this state. We know about the challenges of housing costs in Massachusetts. What would you and your administration do to support independent living centers and programs to allow people with disabilities to live in the most appropriate settings? Well,
we've had that commitment, theoretically, to do that for a while. Since the 1999 decision, we still struggle with, as I mentioned earlier, families who are homeless, who are living in hotels. We know from the foreclosure crisis, unfortunately, that we are still digging out of a statewide crisis around people who have lost their homes and been evicted. But one of the exciting things I think about moving forward, and I know that it is a concern of all of the folks in our cities and towns who are looking at housing and having more available, affordable housing for all parts of our population, including those with disabilities. And I think we have to work city by city with municipalities to see what the housing stock is, how the state can be a better partner to making sure we make that available, get the numbers, and work with the commissions that most of our larger cities have and across the Commonwealth to see what's available, how do we increase either rental vouchers or through other federal or state funds, make that housing available for people. We have some work cut out for us because housing is an issue across the state, but we should move forward to make it as available to everybody as possible.
And I think we have time for one more question. And it is around a tax advantage savings plan for individuals with disabilities and their families, similar to a 529 college savings account, and that account could be used towards housing and perhaps other extraordinary expenses. And the question would be, would you support such a tax advantage savings plan?
Absolutely, and as we are looking at ways in which we can improve our 529 plan here in Massachusetts, I don't think it's as good as some states have. We should be looking at ways that we allow families and individuals to save for the additional expenses, whether it's education or whatever it is. I think that's a great idea, actually, and I would look forward to, I think we could get that through the legislature, and I think it makes total sense to allow people to plan to save some money to move forward. So I'm glad you asked that, because I hadn't thought of that, but we are actually working on something, making that plan better for saving for school. We just passed legislation that looks to be more inclusive as to who can benefit from that.
Well, I want to thank you and all of the candidates who attended today.
Thank you, Thank you very much, everybody.
We appreciate the fact that you took time out of your schedule, and there were a lot of great questions and some wonderful answers and some thoughtful answers, so thank you very much. Appreciate it.
I want to say thank you for hosting us here. I've said you have great candidates at every level. Don't forget, whoever's running for AG is important too, right? You want to pay attention. But we appreciate as candidates the chance to talk with each other, but to talk with you. I think it makes us better candidates. You help educate us about what you need. And I will say one last thing, that it's important not just during this race, but whoever's elected, I hope it's me, but whoever's elected, you need to stay in touch with us. Let's say we want appointments on your commissions. We want to be heard. We want you to know what we face every day and make sure we're doing everything we can to make that better. So thank you for today.
So I just want to say thank you for all of the candidates that spent their afternoon with us today. All of you in the audience that stayed, asked great questions. All of the disability agencies from across the Commonwealth that sponsored and make this possible. John, I'll give you the mic here.
Yeah, just I thank you to Mr. Guy Giles. What a great master of ceremonies and host he was, and I think he deserves a round of applause. And again, thank you to you, Mr. Power. Welcome aboard, and thank you for hosting this great event. And to all of you, thank you for being here. Thank you for showing you care. And most of all, get out and vote. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you.